the fortress, and the lie. The first rule of my meticulously constructed life was simple: maintain distance. It was a fortress built of professionalism, polite detachment, and an unwavering commitment to the predictable. Each wall was a carefully memorized social script, each turret a practiced, neutral smile. Inside, I was safe. Inside, nothing could touch me. My brother James called it being stoic. I knew it for what it was: a containment unit for a person I couldn't afford to let out. This weekend was a geological survey of my fortress walls. A series of controlled demolitions planned by my well-meaning, clueless brother. The mission, as he'd pitched it, was a necessary planning session for his upcoming wedding. Just me, the groom's brother, and his best man, Theodore, holed up in our family's old cabin for 2 days. The official objective? Finalize speeches, coordinate logistics, and drink a respectable amount of whiskey in the name of tradition. The unofficial objective, the one thrumming like a high-voltage wire beneath my skin, was to survive 48 hours in close proximity to Theodore. He was James's oldest friend, a constant fixture on the periphery of my life since childhood. He existed in my memory as a series of sun-drenched snapshots, all bright teeth and confident laughter, the effortless golden boy I'd spent my adolescence studying from the shadows. He moved through the world with an unthinking grace that felt like a personal affront to my own rigid, calculated existence. He was a force of nature, a warm front moving into my carefully climate-controlled environment. And I, the meteorologist of my own misery, could only predict the storm. My lie, the foundational stone of my defense for this weekend, was that it was a chore, an obligation. James is stressing, I'd told my coworkers, my voice flat, practiced. Someone has to keep him from eloping to Vegas. It was a plausible, easily digestible fiction. It painted me as the dutiful brother, the reluctant participant. It was armor, but the truth was a shard of glass in my throat. I had agreed too quickly. The moment James asked, a traitorous, silent yes had formed in my mind before the first syllable of my feigned hesitation had even passed my lips. The thought of the cabin, the scent of pine and wood smoke, the heavy quiet of the mountains, had tangled itself inextricably with the thought of him, of Theodore. He arrived at my apartment to pick me up, his old Land Rover rumbling at the curb like a patient beast. I watched from my window, 4 stories up, as he leaned against the driver's side door, thumbs hooked in his jeans. He wasn't the lanky teenager of my memory anymore. The years had settled on him, broadening his shoulders, carving subtle lines of exhaustion, or maybe just life, around his eyes. He wore a dark wool sweater, the kind that looked soft and smelled of the outdoors, even through reinforced glass. He looks tired. The thought was an unwelcome intruder, a breach in the first line of defense. Observation was supposed to be clinical, detached, not empathetic. I took a final, grounding breath of the sterile, recycled air of my apartment, my fortress. I checked the locks twice. Then I went down to meet him. "Elijah." He smiled when he saw me, and the expression was smaller, quieter than the booming grins I remembered. It was no less devastating. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Ready for the wilderness?" "As I'll ever be," I said, my voice a perfect replica of casual indifference. I tossed my duffel into the back. The lie felt solid, real, a shield I could hold in front of me. He didn't press for more. He just nodded, a small, accepting gesture that was somehow worse than a dozen probing questions. It suggested he already knew me, saw the lines of my cage, and had decided not to rattle them. The magnetic pull I'd always felt in his presence, that subtle, disorienting gravity, was already at work. It tugged at the foundations of my composure, urging me to lean into an orbit I had spent my life trying to escape. The drive north was a study in controlled tension. I focused on the world outside my window, a blur of concrete giving way to green. I cataloged the species of trees, the geology of the rock cuts along the highway, anything to avoid the silent, living presence beside me. He smelled of coffee and something clean, like soap and cold morning air. The scent filled the small cabin of the truck, an invasion of my personal space more intimate than any touch. He drove with one hand resting loosely on the wheel, the other on the gear shift. The casual competence of it was infuriating. Every movement was fluid, economical, no wasted energy. My own hands were clenched in my lap, my posture a rigid testament to the effort of appearing relaxed. "James is a lot right now," Theodore said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the seat. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed on the winding road. "Thanks for doing this. I think he just needed to know we were all on the same page." "It's my job as his brother," I replied, the words pre-packaged, sterile. "It's a lie. I'm here for you. I'm here because I am a fool who wants to stand close to a fire, even knowing he will burn." "Still," he said. A pause stretched, filled only by the hum of the tires on asphalt. "It's good of you." He thinks I'm good. The irony was a bitter pill. I was a scientist of my own fraudulence, and he was an unwitting test subject. I was observing his every move, every subtle shift in posture, every intonation, cataloging data for a conclusion I refused to draw. The pressure in the car was building, a physical weight on my chest. I felt like we were in a deep-sea submersible, the crushing weight of the unspoken pressing in on us from all sides. He was the calm, experienced pilot, and I was the passenger, watching the hairline fractures spread across the viewport, waiting for the inevitable implosion. Theodore was the unwitting catalyst, the agent of chaos introduced into my sealed, sterile experiment of a life. And as we turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, I felt the first definitive crack appear in the walls of my fortress. It was the sound of the world rushing in. It was the sound of the beginning of the end of my quiet, empty peace. The inciting incidents. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. A dark sentinel of log and stone nestled among towering pines. The air that greeted us when Theodore killed the engine was sharp and clean, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke from a distant chimney. For a moment, the sheer, oppressive silence of the place was a comfort. A silence that could swallow secrets whole. We unloaded in a comfortable quiet, the rhythm of our movements falling into an easy, unpracticed sync. I grabbed the bags. He took the cooler. The heavy wooden door groaned open under his hand, and we stepped from the crisp autumn twilight into the cabin's cool, still darkness. Theodore found the breaker box by feel, his fingers tracing the rough-hewn wall. With a solid thunk, the lights flickered on, casting a warm, golden glow over the familiar main room. It was one large space, a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a small kitchen tucked into a corner, and a worn leather sofa facing a large picture window that looked out onto the lake. 2 doors were set into the back wall. One led to the small, functional bathroom, the other to the bedroom, the singular bedroom. "I'll take the couch," I said immediately. The words were out before I'd consciously formed them, a preemptive strike, a boundary drawn in the sand. My professional code, or the personal, far more stringent version of it, demanded it. Proximity was the enemy, and a shared room was a declaration of war on my self-control. Theodore dropped the cooler on the heavy oak table with a thud. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that looked less like a casual tick and more like a manifestation of deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "Don't be ridiculous, Elijah. It's supposed to drop below freezing tonight. The fireplace heats this room, but the bedroom has the only actual space heater. You'll be an ice block by morning." He was right, of course. The logic was sound. My refusal was not. It was pure, instinctual self-preservation. "I'll be fine. I've got a heavy sleeping bag." Another lie. My duffel contained clothes and a laptop, not Arctic survival gear. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw the full extent of the fatigue etched onto his face. The confident, easygoing mask was gone, replaced by something fragile and strained. The armor was cracking on both sides. "Look," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of any forced cheerfulness. "The bed's huge. It's a king. We can build a pillow wall like we're 10 years old if it makes you feel better. But nobody is sleeping on that lumpy disaster of a couch." His gaze was direct, unwavering. It wasn't a challenge. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with a weariness that brooked no argument. It was the first violation of the rules, a necessary breach. He was prioritizing my physical comfort over my clearly articulated, albeit irrational, need for distance. And I, the master of my own fortress, found myself without a counter-argument. My meticulously constructed defenses were useless against simple, unadorned kindness, against a logic that cared more for my well-being than for my unspoken, invisible panic. "Fine," I conceded, the word feeling like a surrender. It tasted like defeat. The air in the room shifted. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed its nature. It was no longer a standoff. It was a treaty, signed under duress. We had agreed to share a space, a small, intimate, inescapable space, for the next 2 nights. The boundary had been breached. We spent the next hour in a flurry of purposeful, boundary-rebuilding activity. We unpacked food. We built a fire in the hearth, the crackle and pop of the logs a welcome noise in the heavy silence. I focused on the mechanics of it, the small, controllable tasks. I chopped vegetables for a stew with methodical precision, the rhythmic thump of the knife on the cutting board, a mantra against the rising tide of anxiety. Theodore moved around the small space with a quiet efficiency that was almost worse than his usual boisterous energy. He was a contained force, a tightly coiled spring. He laid out our sleeping bags on opposite sides of the massive bed in the adjoining room, the space between them a veritable canyon of unclaimed mattress. He plugged in the small, humming space heater. He did not mention it again. We ate our stew sitting on the floor in front of the fire, the heat warming our faces. The unspoken agreement was to keep talking, to fill the air with the mundane logistics of the wedding. We talked about tuxedo fittings and playlists, about James's terrible taste in cake and his fiancée's saintly patience. It was safe territory, impersonal, a shield of practicality held between us. But as the fire burned lower and the whiskey Theodore poured began to warm my veins, the conversation faltered. The silence that crept back in was different. It was heavier now, freighted with the knowledge of the room next door, of the bed waiting for us. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, even from a few feet away. I was acutely aware of the sound of his breathing, the soft sigh as he stretched his legs out towards the flames. My senses were betraying me, turning from passive observers into active traders, feeding me a constant stream of data I didn't want. The rough texture of the wool of his sweater, the scent of wood smoke clinging to his hair, the way the firelight caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes when he turned his head. "Guess we should turn in," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to be absorbed by the dark wood of the cabin walls. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to form a word. My throat felt tight, constricted. I stood, my joints stiff, and carried my bowl to the sink. An act of normalcy in a situation that felt anything but. When I turned back, he was already on his feet, his shadow long and distorted in the flickering firelight. He met my eyes across the room. A shared look. It wasn't long, but it was potent. A silent acknowledgement of the threshold we were about to cross. The final, unavoidable breach of the day's last remaining boundary. The walk from the main room to the bedroom door felt like a mile. Each footstep on the creaking floorboards was a drumbeat, marking the slow, inexorable march towards a surrender I had already made hours ago, when I'd said that single, fatal word. Fine. The escalation. The bedroom was small, and the king-sized bed took up most of it, a vast, white expanse in the dim light. The only illumination came from the faint orange glow of the space heater in the corner. It hummed quietly, a mechanical heartbeat in the otherwise silent room. The air was warm, close, already thick with the scent of us. Wood smoke, soap, the faint, clean smell of laundry from the sheets. My sensory overload began the moment I stepped over the threshold. We moved with a strange, stilted choreography. A silent, awkward dance of two people trying to occupy the same small space without touching, without acknowledging the profound strangeness of it all. I went to the far side of the bed, the side nearest the cold window. It felt safer, colder. I stripped down to my t-shirt and boxers with my back to him, my movements stiff and hurried. The cold air raised goosebumps on my skin. Or maybe it wasn't the cold. I could hear the rustle of his clothes behind me, the soft thud of his jeans hitting the floor. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My internal monologue was a chaotic spiral of analysis and panic. This is just practical. It's about warmth, survival. It means nothing. He is your brother's best friend. He is a line you do not cross. You built these walls for a reason. Do not let him see the cracks. I slid under the covers, the sheets cool against my skin. I pulled the heavy comforter up to my chin, a pathetic excuse for a shield. I lay rigidly on my side, facing the window, my back a solid wall presented to the center of the bed. A moment later, the mattress dipped behind me. The shift in gravity was immense. A planet settling into orbit beside me. I felt the radiating wave of his body heat travel through the mattress, a warmth that had nothing to do with the space heater. It was a living heat, a presence that my skin registered long before my mind could process it. He settled onto his back, the sound of his sigh a soft exhalation in the dark. The silence that followed was pressurized. It was not empty. It was filled with the sound of our breathing, the hum of the heater, the frantic, silent pounding of my own heart against my ribs. I tried to regulate my breath, to make it slow and even. To project an image of sleep I was nowhere near achieving. His breathing was deeper than mine, slower. I found myself listening to its rhythm, the rise and fall of his chest. Without meaning to, my own breathing started to sync with his. Inhale, exhale. A shared, involuntary intimacy that felt more profound than any conversation. We lay like that for what felt like an eternity. Two separate islands in the same sea of mattress. The chasm of pillows between us the only thing marking our territories. I was hyper-aware of every tiny sound, every shift in weight. The night outside was absolute in its blackness, the window a square of deeper shadow. Then, he moved. He turned onto his side, facing my back. The mattress dipped again, closer this time. The radiating heat intensified, a palpable presence just inches from my spine. I could feel it through my t-shirt, a low-grade fever seeping into my skin. I held my breath. He's just getting comfortable, I told myself. It's a big bed, but people move in their sleep. It means nothing. My own logic sounded hollow. A desperate lie whispered in the dark. His arm, the one not trapped beneath him, flopped onto the mattress in the space between us. His fingers brushed against the back of my neck. It was the briefest of contacts. Skin on skin. A spark of pure, unadulterated electricity. A jolt that shot straight down my spine and pooled, hot and heavy, in my stomach. It was an accident. It had to be. A clumsy, sleeping movement. I flinched. A small, involuntary jerk of my muscles. His hand retreated instantly, as if burned. The silence that followed was different. It was sharp, acute. The pretense of sleep was shattered. We were both awake. We were both acutely aware of what had just happened. The unintentional touch. The accidental breach of the final, most intimate barrier. I lay there, frozen, my mind racing. I was drowning in a sea of over-analysis. Should I say something? Apologize for flinching? Pretend it never happened? The air grew thick with unspoken words, with the weight of that fleeting, electric contact. I could feel him behind me, just as still, just as silent. I imagined I could feel the heat of his embarrassment, or his confusion, radiating across the small gap between us. After another long, agonizing minute, he shifted again, rolling onto his back with a quiet sigh of what sounded like resignation. The immediate, intense heat at my back receded, leaving a strange, phantom cold in its place. The loss of it was an ache. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and shallow. I woke several times, each time with a disorienting sense of panic, my body rigid, my senses on high alert. Each time, the first thing I registered was the soft, rhythmic sound of his breathing beside me, a constant, grounding presence in the dark, a reminder that I was not alone in my fortress, that someone was inside the walls with me. The next morning, the tension was a third person in the room. We avoided eye contact, moving through the small space with the same careful, stilted choreography as the night before. We made coffee, our hands brushing as we both reached for the kettle. Another accidental touch, another jolt of static electricity. I pulled my hand back as if I'd touched a live wire. "Sorry," I mumbled, my eyes fixed on the floor. "It's fine," he said, his voice rough with sleep. We took our mugs outside, leaning against the railing of the porch. The morning was cold and bright, the air so clean it hurt to breathe. The lake was a sheet of dark, still glass, reflecting the fiery colors of the autumn trees. It was beautiful. It was a beauty I couldn't appreciate, because my entire consciousness was focused on the man standing 3 feet to my left. He took a sip of his coffee, the ceramic mug dwarfed in his hand. He was staring out at the lake, but his focus seemed to be somewhere else entirely. His brow was furrowed, a deep line of concentration between his eyes. The confident mask was gone again. He just looked lost. I risked a glance at him, a quick, observational sweep. The morning light was unforgiving, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes, the faint stubble on his jaw. He looked vulnerable. And in that moment of unguarded observation, he turned his head and met my eyes. The gaze held. It wasn't like the brief, practical looks we'd exchanged before. This was different. There was no pretense in it, no social script. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered connection. His brown eyes, so full of a deep, weary sadness, seemed to look straight through my carefully constructed facade. He wasn't just looking at me. He was seeing me. He saw the tension in my shoulders, the fear in my eyes, the fortress I had built around myself. And in his eyes, I saw a mirror of my own loneliness, a shared, silent confession. My heart hammered against my ribs. The world narrowed to the space between us. The sounds of the forest, the smell of the coffee, the cold air on my skin, it all faded away. There was only the magnetic pull of his gaze, a force of gravity holding me in place, stripping away my armor piece by piece. I felt utterly, terrifyingly exposed. I should have looked away. The rules, my entire system of self-preservation screamed at me to break contact, to retreat to the safety of indifference. But I couldn't. I was trapped in his orbit, caught in a moment of such profound, silent understanding that looking away felt like a betrayal. It was he who finally broke the gaze, turning his head back towards the lake with a slow, deliberate movement. He took a deep, shuddering breath that was almost a sigh. "It's quiet here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The spell was broken. The pressure was released. But something had irrevocably shifted. A wall had come down. Not a small one, a foundational one. We had seen each other, truly seen each other, and there was no going back to the safety of pretending we were strangers. The escalation was complete. We were no longer just two men sharing a room. We were two lonely people who had just admitted it to each other, without saying a single word. The vulnerability shift. The rest of the day passed in a strange, muted haze. The charged silence of the morning had given way to a fragile, tentative peace. We went through the motions of our assigned task, spreading maps of the wedding venue across the big oak table, making notes in the margins, discussing timelines and responsibilities. But the work was a pretense, a flimsy scaffolding erected around the new, cavernous space that had opened up between us. I found myself watching him, no longer trying to hide it. I watched the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he chewed on the end of his pen, the unconscious way he ran a hand through his already messy hair when he was wrestling with a thought. These were not the actions of the effortlessly confident man I had always perceived him to be. They were the small human tics of someone under immense pressure. The golden boy was tarnished. The facade was cracking, and I was transfixed by the real person showing through underneath. We decided to go for a walk in the late afternoon, to clear our heads. The air had grown colder, and the sky was a high, thin blue. We walked the trail that circled the lake, the ground soft with fallen pine needles under our boots. We didn't talk much. The silence was comfortable now, less a vacuum and more a shared blanket. We stopped at a small rocky outcrop that overlooked the water. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line on the far side of the lake, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. Theodore stood at the edge, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, his shoulders slumped. "Are you okay?" The question escaped me before I could stop it. It was a direct violation of my primary rule, maintain distance. It was an invitation, an opening. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I thought he was going to ignore me, to deflect with a casual, "I'm fine." But he didn't. "No," he said. The word so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. He finally turned to look at me, and the raw, undisguised misery in his eyes was a physical blow. "No, Elijah. I'm really not." And then it all came tumbling out. The confession. Not the one I had been dreading, but a different, more shattering one. He spoke in a low, halting voice, the words torn from a place of deep exhaustion. He talked about his job, the crushing weight of expectations at his father's law firm. He talked about the wedding, the pressure of being the perfect best man for James, of holding his best friend's life together, while his own was quietly falling apart. And then he told me about his girlfriend, Chloe. a name I'd heard James mention 100 times. He told me they had fought, a terrible, final-sounding fight, the night before he'd driven up here. She'd given him an ultimatum: the job or her. The life his father wanted for him, or the life she wanted with him. He was trapped between two impossible choices, and the weight of it was breaking him. "I'm supposed to be the reliable one," he said, a bitter, self-mocking laugh escaping his lips. "Good old Theo. Always has it together. And I'm drowning. I feel like I'm standing in the middle of a burning building and everyone is telling me what a lovely, warm day it is." He finally looked away from me, swiping at his eyes with the back of his hand in a gesture of angry frustration. He was trying to rebuild his walls, to shove the vulnerability back into its box. But it was too late. I had seen it. I had seen the crack in the facade, the deep, foundational weakness in the man I had always viewed as a pillar of strength. And in that moment, something inside me shifted on a tectonic level. The hyper-analytical observer, the cold, detached scientist of my own isolation, simply vanished. He was replaced by a ferocious, unfamiliar instinct, a primal urge that overrode every rule, every carefully constructed defense. The protector instinct. I saw him not as Theodore, the catalyst for my own internal chaos, the object of a terrifying and unwanted magnetic pull. I saw a man in pain, a man who was hurting and hiding it from the world with a practiced smile. I saw someone who needed a safe harbor, a moment of reprieve from the storm of his own life. My role reversed. I was no longer the one being acted upon, the one whose defenses were being tested. I was the one who needed to act. The dynamic of our entire relationship, a relationship that had existed for years only in the periphery, and for the last 24 hours in a state of intense, unspoken tension, was rewritten in that instant. I took a step towards him, then another. I stopped when I was standing beside him, our shoulders almost touching. I didn't say anything. There were no words. The scripts I had spent a lifetime memorizing were useless here. They were written for a different play entirely. So I just stood there, a silent, solid presence beside him. I offered him the only thing I had, my stillness, my quiet. I became a wall for him to lean against, not a fortress to keep him out. I was offering him sanctuary in the one place I had always considered my own private prison. He didn't look at me, but I felt the tension in his shoulders ease almost imperceptibly. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the same sound I'd heard in the dark of our room, but this time it wasn't one of resignation. It sounded like relief. We stood there for a long time, watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mountains, plunging the lake into a deep, velvety twilight. The cold started to seep into our bones, but neither of us made a move to leave. The reversal was complete. My terror of his proximity had been replaced by a desperate, urgent need to provide him comfort. My fear of vulnerability had been eclipsed by the sight of his. For the first time in my adult life, my focus was entirely outside of myself. The cacophony of my own internal conflict had been silenced by the quiet hum of his pain. I had spent my entire life building walls to protect myself. I never imagined that their true purpose might be to shelter someone else. As we finally turned to walk back to the cabin in the gathering dark, my shoulder brushed against his. This time, there was no jolt of electricity, no panicked retreat. There was only a simple, grounding warmth, a small point of contact in a vast, cold world. This time, I didn't pull away. The turning points. The atmosphere back in the cabin was thick with a new kind of intimacy. The vulnerability Theodore had shown by the lake hung in the air, a tangible presence. It had stripped away the last remnants of pretense between us. We were no longer just the groom's brother and the best man. We were Elijah and Theodore, just two men in a small wooden box, surrounded by the vast, indifferent darkness of the mountains. We didn't bother with the pretense of wedding planning. The maps and lists lay forgotten on the table. Instead, we rebuilt the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating an isolated bubble of warmth and light. The rest of the world, with its crushing expectations and impossible choices, felt a million miles away. Theodore sat on the floor, his back against the worn leather sofa, a tumbler of whiskey cradled in his hands. He was quiet, but it was a different quiet than before. It was the calm after a storm, a stillness born of exhaustion rather than tension. I sat a few feet away, nursing my own drink, my role as silent guardian now firmly established. I was a lighthouse keeper, and he was a ship that had found a temporary, safe harbor. I could feel him watching me. I didn't have to look to know it. It was a weight, a pressure on my skin. When I finally risked a glance, his eyes met mine. There was no sadness in them now, just a deep, searching intensity. "Why are you so quiet, Elijah?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. The direct question was a stone thrown into the still pool of our silence. It wasn't an accusation, it was a genuine inquiry. He was trying to see inside my fortress, not to breach it, but because I had just let him into mine. "I'm a listener," I said, the answer a half-truth. It was one of my standard, pre-approved scripts. He shook his head slowly, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. "No," he said. "That's not it. It's more than that. It's like you're holding your breath all the time." His perception was a scalpel, cutting through layers of my carefully constructed persona with surgical precision. He saw me. He had seen me this morning, and he was seeing me even more clearly now. The feeling of being so utterly exposed was terrifying, but it was also a relief. The weight of the armor was immense. The thought of setting it down was a temptation I had never allowed myself to consider. "I'm not good at this," I said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us, at the entire concept of unstructured, unscripted human interaction. The confession felt like a betrayal of my own core principles. "You were good at it this afternoon," he countered softly. "By the lake. You were solid. You were the only solid thing in my world right now." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. They were a validation of the new, unfamiliar instinct that had taken over me. They were a gift. And they were a challenge. The fire crackled, filling the silence. The whiskey was a slow, spreading warmth in my chest, loosening the knots of a lifetime of self-control. I felt myself standing on the edge of a precipice. Behind me was the cold, safe, empty fortress I had always known. In front of me was a terrifying, unknown landscape, and Theodore was standing on the other side, holding out a hand. The final threshold was right in front of me. All I had to do was choose to cross it. He shifted, setting his empty glass down on the floor with a soft click. He moved closer, closing half the distance between us. He didn't sit, but knelt, his proximity a deliberate, undeniable statement. The heat from his body was a furnace. His scent, whiskey, wool, and wood smoke, was intoxicating. "Elijah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He held my gaze, his own eyes dark and pleading in the firelight. And then came the direct challenge. The verbal plea that made it impossible to retreat. "Don't leave me alone tonight." It wasn't a question. It was a command born of desperate need. It wasn't about the cold or the logistics of the bed. It was a raw, naked admission of loneliness, a plea for connection. He was asking me to stay inside the walls with him, not as a prisoner of circumstance, but as a willing companion. My mind screamed. Every alarm bell, every self-preservation instinct I had ever cultivated was blaring. Retreat, deflect, make a joke, rebuild the wall. This is dangerous. This is the point of no return. But my heart, that long, dormant, traitorous organ, said something else entirely. Stay. The conscious choice was mine to make. I could obey the rules that had kept me safe but isolated for my entire life. Or I could listen to the new, terrifying instinct that told me safety wasn't the point. Connection was. I looked at him. Truly looked at him. At the exhaustion and the fear and the hope warring in his eyes. I saw my own loneliness reflected there. My own desperate, unspoken yearning for a hand to hold in the dark. I made my choice. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and placed it on his knee. The rough texture of his jeans was a grounding reality under my palm. It was a simple gesture, a small point of contact, but it was an answer. It was the crossing of the threshold. I surrendered. His eyes closed for a moment, and a long, shuddering breath escaped him. It was the sound of a man who had been holding up the world and had finally been given permission to set it down. When he opened his eyes again, the desperation was gone, replaced by a profound, heart-stopping gratitude. Okay, he whispered, and I whispered back the only word that mattered. The only truth left in the world. Okay. The surrender. The journey to the bedroom this time was not a march of defeat. It was a deliberate, silent procession. The tension that had defined our movements the night before was gone, replaced by a heavy, resonant gravity that pulled us along in its wake. There was no awkward choreography, no careful avoidance of contact. Theodore's hand rested lightly on the small of my back as we walked, a simple, grounding pressure that anchored me in the new reality I had just chosen. Inside the room, the space heater still hummed its quiet, mechanical song. The bed was as we had left it, a vast landscape of white, the canyon of pillows still marking a border that no longer existed. Theodore moved to the far side of the bed and with a single sweeping motion cleared the pillows away, tossing them onto the chair in the corner. The gesture was a demolition, a final, unambiguous tearing down of the last wall between us. We undressed in the dim, warm light, the silence comfortable, charged with anticipation rather than anxiety. This time, I didn't turn away. I watched him, the firelight from the other room casting long shadows across the planes of his back and shoulders. He was not the idealized, untouchable figure of my imagination. He was real. He was tired and burdened and beautiful in his imperfection. When we slipped under the covers, the cool sheets were a momentary shock before the heat of our bodies began to fill the space. He turned onto his side to face me, and I did the same. We lay there, inches apart, the air between us electric. This was the moment for the truth. The initial lie, the flimsy armor of obligation I had worn into this weekend, felt like a distant, ridiculous memory. It was time to dismantle it completely. Theodore, I started, my voice rough, unfamiliar. Shh, he whispered, his eyes searching mine in the darkness. It's okay. No, I insisted, the word coming out stronger than I expected. It's not. I have to. I wasn't honest. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. This was harder than any physical touch, this act of laying my own motivations bare. I didn't just come here for James. That was the excuse. The reason I could give myself. The confession hung in the air between us. The truth of my yearning, my foolish, magnetic pull towards him, was finally out of its cage. He didn't seem surprised. A soft, understanding smile touched his lips. "I know," he said. "Or, I hoped." "Why did you come, Elijah?" The question demanded the final, terrifying truth. "Because you were going to be here," I admitted, the words a quiet rush of air. I wanted to be near you, even if it was just for a weekend, even if it was just pretending." A single tear escaped the corner of his eye and traced a silver path down his temple. He didn't wipe it away. He just looked at me, his expression one of profound, aching relief. "I'm so tired of pretending," he whispered, and then he closed the small distance between us. The climactic embrace was not one of frantic passion, but of desperate, soul-deep need. It was a collapse, a surrender. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me tight against his chest, and buried his face in the crook of my neck. I could feel the shudder that ran through his entire body, a release of tension that he must have been holding for months or years. My own arms came up, circling his back, my hands splaying across the warmth of his t-shirt. I held on to him as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. He was so warm, so real. The rough texture of his stubble against my neck, the scent of his skin, the solid, steady beat of his heart against my ear. It was an avalanche of sensory information that short-circuited my analytical brain and went straight to the core of me. This was not about desire in its simplest form. It was about sanctuary. It was about the profound, grounding relief of no longer being alone. I was holding him, but he was holding me up, too. We were two collapsing structures, leaning against each other, creating a new, stronger shape together. His breath was hot against my skin. I could feel the dampness of his tears. He held me tighter, a desperate, anchoring grip. This was the surrender, not just for me, but for him too. A surrender to vulnerability, to need, to the terrifying, beautiful solace of being truly seen by another person. We stayed like that for a long, timeless moment. There were no more words to be said. Everything had been communicated in the silent language of touch, of proximity, of a shared and desperate need. The fire in the next room crackled and popped. The space heater hummed its steady rhythm. And in the small, warm bed in the middle of the vast, dark woods, two fortresses finally, completely, crumbled to dust. The new silence. I woke slowly, drifting up from the first deep, dreamless sleep I'd had in years. The first thing I registered was the warmth, a profound, enveloping heat that was not my own. The second was the weight. A heavy arm draped over my waist, a solid leg tangled with mine. My eyes fluttered open. The room was filled with the soft, gray light of dawn filtering through the window. Theodore was still asleep, his face turned towards me, his breath a soft, even puff against my cheek. He looked younger in sleep, the lines of stress and exhaustion smoothed away. He looked peaceful. My fortress was gone. My rules were shattered. And in their place was this quiet, undeniable reality. My panic, the constant low-grade hum of anxiety that had been the soundtrack to my life, was gone. In its place was a stillness I had never known. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't the pressurized, tense silence of the first night, or the fragile, tentative silence of the day before. This was a new silence. It was comfortable, grounding. It was the silence of two people who had nothing left to hide from each other. It was a shared space, not an empty one. I lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake him. I watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, the way the pale morning light caught on the tips of his eyelashes. My hyper-analytical mind, which had spent the last 48 hours in a state of overdrive, was finally quiet. There was nothing to analyze. There was only this: the irrefutable sensory truth of his body next to mine, the rough texture of his morning stubble, the clean, warm scent of his skin, the grounding weight of his arm holding me in place. He stirred, a low murmur in the back of his throat, and his arm tightened around me, pulling me closer in his sleep. It was an unconscious, instinctual movement, a gesture of seeking comfort, and it sent a wave of something warm and fierce through my chest. It felt like protection. It felt like home. Eventually his eyes opened, slowly, blinking against the morning light. They found mine immediately. There was a moment of disorientation, then a slow, dawning realization. A soft smile touched his lips. It was not the bright, confident grin of his public persona, nor the weary, strange smile of his confession. This was something new, something quiet and private, and meant only for me. "Morning," he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my own voice a quiet rasp. There was no awkwardness, no morning after panic or regret. There was only a simple, profound sense of rightness. We didn't move. We just lay there, looking at each other in the quiet morning light, a silent conversation passing between us. It was an unspoken pact. His eyes held a question, a hint of the world outside this room, of the problems that hadn't magically disappeared. The job, Chloe, the wedding, my own lifetime of isolation. But his gaze also held a promise. "We figure this out. Together." I answered with a small, almost imperceptible nod. An acceptance. A promise of my own. Yes. We do. We would have to leave this cabin. We would have to return to the world of noise and expectations and carefully constructed facades. But something had been fundamentally rewired. We would not be returning as the same men who had arrived. The silence between us was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge. The space between us was no longer a chasm to be feared, but a home to be shared. He finally disentangled himself, the loss of his warmth an immediate, noticeable ache. But it wasn't a retreat. It was just the practical necessity of starting a new day. He stood and stretched, and I watched him, no longer an observer studying a foreign species, but a partner watching a familiar, cherished landscape. The journey from armored isolation to vulnerable connection was not a single heroic leap across a canyon. It was a series of small, terrifying steps. It was a forced proximity, an accidental touch, a shared gaze. It was the choice to listen, the instinct to protect, the courage to confess, and the final, quiet relief of surrender. Strength, I was beginning to understand, was not the quality of the walls you built around your heart. It was the courage to finally let someone in to see the cracks. It was the quiet realization that the only thing worth protecting was the connection itself.